Okay, picking up where we left off, we're looking at the population growth curve, and there's going to be our theoretical, right, the stuff that we think or hypothetically should happen, and then there's what actually happens, and this is an example of what actually happens. Um, Values that we need to know in our population growth curves, B is going to be birth rate, D, death rate, T is going to be time, N will be my actual population size at that moment, and D will be delta or change. There are two theories or two models, right? And this is hypothetical. It's never actually like this. The first is going to be the exponential model, which is blue. I'll put this all up so you can write it down if you wish. The blue model is not what happens. We call it a J curve, and this is what would happen if there were no limiting factors. So if there was a ton of food, ton of water, ton of everything. Basically what would happen is our species would just continue getting huge. This cannot happen. The idea is that as there is a direct correlation between size of population and rate. What that means is that as my population gets bigger, the speed of how big it gets increases. And that makes sense, right? If I have 10 organisms and then my population size doubles and then it doubles again, every time it doubles, not only am I getting bigger, but I also have more organisms to make more of those offspring. And so we call it K and N, right? Or sorry, R, right, which is my rate or rate max, and N, which is my size. Those are going to directly correlate as they increase. The logistic model is slightly closer to what we see, still a model, which means that there's a lot more fluctuations than this perfect little S-curve. But the red shows an S-curve, and the S-curve responds to what we call K, which is the carrying capacity. The idea is that as N approaches K, my rate is going to slow down. What does that mean? It means that as my size starts reaching the limit of how big my population can be, the rate of which we reproduce is going to start slowing down. Things get in the way, like the amount of food, predation, size, disease, because my population is too big. All of these things start to limit the rate. Again, we see the exponential growth curve. Basically, this exhibits what would happen if there were no limiting factors. But unless we're in a lab, and this would be an example of something in a lab, we never ever see this type of growth curve. The logistic growth curve model makes a lot more sense, and this slide just goes over what I already talked about, right? Basically, it begins as the exponential model, and it adds on an expression to the equation that basically indicates that as N approaches K, right, as my population size approaches the limit, my rate is going to slow down. That's basically all this is saying. And this is what we see in this logistic growth curve model. Some organisms actually exhibit this perfectly. They hit the carrying capacity and then they stay very non-fluctuating. It's a better word for that. I mean, they stick to that carrying capacity. They don't fluctuate a lot around that line. This is a comparison of those two things. Obviously, we can see that the main difference is that little triangle between the two. And the question is, what makes the difference? What makes the difference between a J and an S curve is any sort of environmental resistance. Environmental resistance is going to be limiting size, limiting food, other limiting species, disease, physical and chemical resources that the species needs. All of those things are what fill in that orange space, the environmental resistance, that keeps the organisms where they need to be. So unless we are controlling the environment, right? If I'm in a lab in a petri dish and I can keep feeding my organisms, we're not going to reach biotic potential, which is hypothetically how big that species could get, which is exponential and probably indefinite. This is a good space to practice graphing if it's something that you struggled with over this summer. Do not feel like you need to do this. We will go over it in class, but this is kind of an example of what you will need to do on the AP test. This is the comparison answer if you want to look at it. Population reproductive strategy. So there's two main organisms, or groups of organisms, I should say, that kind of dictate how a population will grow. We call them R-selected and K-selected. R-selected species, we're going to see very big changes very fast in the population size. They mature very quickly. They have a very short lifespan. They have many small offspring, so think like fish laying hundreds of eggs, frogs, bacteria, insects, plants spreading like millions of granules of pollen and seeds. There is no parental care. Basically, I give birth to millions of things and hope that some survive, and then there's a very high death rate as well. So we see very sharp increases and decreases in the size just because I give birth to so many and then a ton of them can die off and then I can come back really quickly. It fluctuates a lot. But this actually makes these populations, these types of species, more viable when there are extremes. These populations will be cut down very small, very quickly, but as long as there's a couple organisms to replenish the population size, they will come back. The K-selected species actually require a lot more time to generate a large population. This is why most of our endangered species are K-selected species. They have a long maturation. Although they live for a long time, they don't reach reproductive viability very quickly. They have a few very large offspring. Think humans, right? I can only have 1 to 3, maybe 4 at a time naturally. Dogs and cats, they have a few more, right? 5 or 6 in a litter, 8, whereas a lot of large mammals only have 1. Extended parental care, right? If I have 1 offspring, I want to make sure that 1 offspring survives and the death rate is really low. But what that does mean is that if I'm only having 1 offspring a year and my population gets decimated for some reason, I'm going to have a hard time rebuilding that population. Think any endangered species, rhinos, elephants, things that were poached, right? They all really struggle. And something to remember is that organisms don't perfectly fit into the logistic growth model, which is obviously a little bit better than the exponential growth model. We see that these are both R-selected species, so they do reproduce really quickly, but paramecium, basically once they hit that carrying capacity, they level out and have stable density, whereas these fleas, Daphnia, are going to jump above the carrying capacity, go below, and they'll fluctuate up and down for quite a while. Usually the shorter the lifespan, the more they will show this fluctuating population size. Something to remember is that just because my population size changes does not mean that things are dying. This is a mistake we made when we talked about lemmings. Lemmings are these like little furry critters that in a Disney movie, and like Disney movies are darker than we think, Disney movies showed this like mass exodus of lemmings jumping off a cliff to their death because in the US they were experiencing these weird fluctuations in population. What they later found, these ecologists discovered, is that they were just moving out of the area in large groups. And so what we need to remember is that population size data does not always reflect just deaths and births, right? If all of my population leave for some reason, that also impacts what's going on. The last thing to talk about when we talk about population is that these age structure diagrams are really useful for determining the future of my population. If we look at an interpretation of this, we see that it shows what percent of the population is in a certain age bracket. If I look at the very far left in Afghanistan, we see that the largest section of the population are from 0 to 4. What does that mean? That basically my population is going to experience a really big boom. If we look basically from 24 to 0 is where most of the population lies. About half of that, a little bit less, is going to be able to have offspring. Therefore, we're going to see a big boom in population size. What we see is that in the center one, we'll see slow growth, no growth in our Italy. Basically, the smaller the base is, the less growth, because those are going to be the ones in the next generation that are having the offspring. We'll talk about the guppies. This is a little web quest that we may have time to do. You can like search it if you really want to, but we will talk about this. I'm going to pause it here because this is the last kind of section, and I want to like separate it from the other ecology material. This next video will be the last video for this this little section of information.